Ready to rewrite some history?
I'm in.
Today we're throwing out the old textbook and diving into a side of the past they don't usually teach you.
The forgotten stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The story of how Africa, yes, Africa was at the heart of shaping the modern world.
Yeah, we're talking about a perspective that's often been, I don't know, minimized, brushed aside, just plain left out. It's time to set the record straight.
Absolutely. And we're using Howard W. French's Born in Blackness as our guide.
Great book.
It really is.
Yeah.
It boldly challenges those old narratives and reveals the incredible impact of Africa, particularly through the lens of the transatlantic slave trade.
It's about understanding that the rise of the West wasn't just about European ingenuity or ambition. I mean, it was deeply intertwined with the exploitation of an entire continent.
And to think, it all starts with gold. Most people think of Columbus when they hear about the discovery of the Americas.
Right. Classic story.
But French paints a different picture. He says those European explorers were initially obsessed with Africa.
Really?
Yeah, specifically the legendary wealth of the Mali Empire.
It's almost impossible to overstate the opulence on display during Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca. And, we're not just talking about a rich king here. We're talking about a level of wealth that would make today's billionaires blush.
It's mind-boggling.
And the craziest part, this one event, this display of gold was like a magnet, drawing European ambition towards Africa with a force that would change the course of history.
So instead of focusing on those traditional tales of exploration, we're talking about a gold rush, right? Europe gets wind of this incredible wealth, and suddenly, Africa is at the center of their ambitions. What happens next? How does this essential pivot, as French calls it, actually play out?
It becomes a story of gold, then sugar, and the tragic birth of a system that would scar the world for centuries, the transatlantic slave trade. But it happens in stages, and understanding those stages is key to grasping the full impact.
Okay, let's unpack those stages. First, there's gold.
The Portuguese, fueled by the rumors of Mansa Musa's riches, established a major trading post in what is now Ghana Elmina Castle.
Wait, Elmina Castle, as in the infamous slave trading post. It was originally all about the gold.
Exactly. It begins with the control of Africa's gold-rich kingdoms. And this isn't just a one-sided story of exploitation either. The Akan people, for example, were incredible traders. They recognized the value in what the Portuguese offered, goods, weaponry, and they engaged in trade that benefited them too.
It's a good reminder that history is never simple, right? We tend to gravitate towards these narratives of inevitable European dominance, but these early interactions were much more complex, a real clash of ambitions.
Precisely. You have these two groups, each trying to leverage the situation to their advantage. And out of this complex dance emerges something new, something truly horrific, the sugar plantations of São Tomé. This small island off the coast of Africa became the tragic testing ground for a new kind of slavery.
So we're not just talking about the exploitation of African labor. We're talking about the birth of a system, the plantation complex, that would be replicated across the Atlantic with devastating consequences.
It's crucial to understand that slavery already existed in Africa, but it bore little resemblance to the chattel slavery that the Portuguese developed. This was different. This was dehumanization on a massive scale, turning human beings into commodities.
It's chilling to think about how this system, born out of greed and a perverse kind of innovation, would go on to shape the destinies of nations.
And to truly understand its impact, we need to move beyond the dates and figures. We need to delve into the human cost and the inspiring stories of African resistance.
We see this in the story of Queen Njinga, who fiercely resisted Portuguese encroachment in Angola for decades. And then there's the Kingdom of Kongo, which skillfully navigated the complexities of diplomacy and religion while fighting tooth and nail to maintain its sovereignty.
These stories of defiance, often relegated to footnotes in our history books, challenge us to see this period not just as a narrative of victimhood, but as a testament to the resilience and agency of African people. They never stopped fighting for their freedom.
So while Africans were actively resisting this brutal system, another power was rising in the East. And they saw a whole new opportunity in the transatlantic slave trade.
That's right. We've talked about the Portuguese and their early dominance.
Right.
But it was England that would ultimately grasp the full economic potential of the transatlantic slave trade, using it to fuel its rise as a global superpower.
And it all circles back to sugar.
Right, precisely. While Portugal and Spain stumbled through those early days of colonization, grappling with disease and resistance, England observed, strategized, and perfected a system that was as brutal as it was efficient.
That's where Barbados comes into play, right?
Yes.
French describes this tiny island, becoming the model for England's plantation system.
Absolutely. Barbados becomes this experiment in ruthless efficiency. Plantations dedicated entirely to sugar,
Wow.
importing everything else they need, and squeezing every ounce of labor from the enslaved Africans working the land.
It's a stark contrast to the almost feudal approach we see in the early Portuguese and Spanish colonies.
Mhm.
This was something different, something colder, more calculated.
This is where we see the emergence of a purely capitalist system
Right.
where profit is paramount and human lives are reduced to mere units of production.
It's a chilling thought, and it leads to what French calls England's big jolt. This sudden surge of wealth, fueled by sugar and slave labor, lays the foundation for the Industrial Revolution.
It's a provocative claim, but one that French backs up with compelling evidence. He meticulously traces how the profits from sugar plantations flood into England, creating new markets, spurring investment in industries like textiles,
Yeah.
and ultimately providing the capital necessary for industrialization.
It really makes you reconsider that whole narrative of the Industrial Revolution as a period of pure innovation and progress, doesn't it? Seeing how those roots are so deeply entangled with the exploitation of an entire continent really changes your perspective.
It throws those advancements into a whole new light. And the impact wasn't just economic. Think about the cultural shifts happening during this time. The rise of coffee houses, for example, fueled by that cheap sugar pouring in from the colonies. Right. Created these new spaces for public discourse, debate, and the exchange of ideas.
It's almost ironic, wouldn't you say, that the very system built on dehumanizing an entire race also contributes to these Enlightenment ideals of reason and individual liberty.
That irony, that contradiction, is woven into the very fabric of this story. The wealth and power of the West are inextricably linked to the exploitation of Africa.
It's a sobering realization. It forces you to look at the achievements of the modern world and grapple with the dark undercurrents that made those achievements possible.
And it's not just about the past. French goes on to argue that the legacy of slavery didn't disappear with emancipation. It continues to shape racial and economic disparities to this day.
We see this when he dives into the Haitian Revolution and its aftermath. Here you have this incredibly significant historical event, the first successful slave revolt in history, a beacon of hope for oppressed people everywhere. But instead of leading to widespread change, it ultimately contributes to the expansion of slavery in the United States.
It's hard to imagine the fear that gripped slaveholders across the Americas after the Haitian Revolution. The very foundation of their world had been shaken. The unthinkable had happened.
And their fear wasn't unfounded. This wasn't just paranoia, it was a calculated response to a very real threat. The book talks about Napoleon's failure to retake Haiti and how that directly relates to the Louisiana Purchase.
Exactly. Napoleon, defeated and desperate to recoup some of his losses, puts the Louisiana Territory on the market. And Jefferson, equally determined to secure the future of slavery in the United States, sees an opportunity.
So the Louisiana Purchase, which on the surface seems like just another land deal, is actually deeply intertwined with the fear of slave revolts and the expansion of slavery. It really highlights just how interconnected these events were.
It's a stark reminder that history rarely unfolds in a linear fashion. What might seem like progress in one part of the world can have unintended, even tragic consequences elsewhere.
It's a good reminder that we can't just look at these historical events in isolation. We have to consider the ripple effects, the ways in which they intersect and influence each other.
Exactly. And often it's in those connections, those seemingly unrelated events, that we find the most insightful and often unsettling truths.
It's like we've been looking at this tapestry, but only from the back. You know, all these tangled threads, seemingly random events.
Right.
But when you flip it over,
You see the bigger picture.
the undeniable connections.
Yeah, and one of the most unsettling truths, French reveals, is how deeply this history shaped the very idea of blackness itself.
It wasn't just about skin color, was it?
No, not at all. It was about constructing an entire category of otherness, a way to justify, the horrors of the slave trade, to create a hierarchy that placed Europeans at the top and Africans beneath them.
And that manufactured otherness, that
Yes.
division, it didn't just disappear when slavery ended, did it?
Sadly, no. That's one of the most enduring tragedies of this story. Those lines of division drawn in the name of profit and power continue to cast a shadow on our world today.
It's almost like this entire system was designed not only to extract wealth from Africa, but to erase its history, its contributions, its humanity.
And reclaiming that lost history is a vital part of what French sets out to do in Born in Blackness. He wants us to move beyond just the narratives of victimhood and recognize Africa's vibrant and complex past a history filled with innovation, resilience, and incredible acts of resistance.
It's eye-opening to read about the often overlooked roles Africans played in shaping the Americas. For example, I was blown away by the stories of Black conquistadors
Oh, wow.
fighting alongside the Spanish and the escaped slaves forming maroon communities, fighting for their freedom centuries before the Civil War.
Those stories shatter the simplistic narratives we're often fed about race and history. They reveal a much more nuanced reality, one where the lines between oppressor and oppressed weren't always so clearly defined.
And this isn't just about revising our understanding of the past. It's about recognizing how those hidden truths continue to shape the present. Like when French brings the narrative to a close, he doesn't end with emancipation or celebrations of progress. He takes us straight to the Jim Crow South.
Exactly. He draws that direct line from the plantation complex to the systems of segregation and racial violence that persisted for generations. It's a stark reminder that the fight for equality didn't end with the abolition of slavery. It's an ongoing struggle.
It's a heavy realization, but also a powerful call to action. It's not enough to simply acknowledge these injustices. We have to actively challenge the systems that perpetuate them.
Absolutely. French urges us to view the world through a new lens, one that acknowledges Africa's central role in shaping modernity and confronts the uncomfortable truths of the past. Not to wallow in guilt or shame, but to understand how those legacies continue to manifest in our world today.
So what can we do? If we accept this reframing of history, this deeper understanding, where do we go from here?
That's the question, isn't it? Born in Blackness isn't just a history lesson, it's a call to action. It asks us to consider how our understanding of global power dynamics shifts when we recognize Africa's true place in the narrative. It challenges us to think critically about the legacies of colonialism and to work towards a more just and equitable future.
Well, if you're ready to challenge your assumptions and dive into a side of history that's often ignored, Born in Blackness is an absolute must-read. It's a powerful book that stays with you long after you've finished the last page.
It's a book that has the power to change the way you see the world, and that's what this deep dive is all about. We're here to explore new perspectives, uncover those hidden truths, and encourage you to think differently about the world around you. So until next time,
Keep asking those tough questions.
and keep diving deep.